Now we're going to talk about the Memento design pattern. The Memento design pattern essentially says create a backup of a particular object state, but it says that in such a way that it's a design pattern way of creating a backup, not just a normal way of backupping. It says without violating encapsulation. That encapsulation is the fundamental basis of creating an object. The object allows you to store stuff privately and publicly and so forth, and that's encapsulating both data and methods. That's encapsulation. Without violating encapsulation, store a object's state externally in such a way that it could be recreated, such a way that it could be reintroduced. In other words, create a backup of the object, but in a way that doesn't violate its encapsulation and allows you to store the state of the object externally. So, for example, you might have a database system, and you might say, well, there's a database, and here's the client code that interacts with that database. And you might want to create a backup of that database in case the client code does something that corrupts the database. So you might say, okay, well, let's create a backup, a save state object. So that save state object is going to store the internal state of the database so that it can be recreated, so that it can be rebuilt if the client code messes up that database. So that is okay as far as it goes. It's got a save state object that saves the internal state of the database externally. However, notice that the client code also has access to the save state object. That would violate the encapsulation of the database. So this isn't quite right. This picture isn't quite right because although the save state object can let you save the database's internal state externally for backup purposes, it's not going to preserve the database's encapsulation because it gives the client code access to the save state. So that's not quite right. We've got to make a little bit of a change here, and the way that's going to work is like this. Here's the client code, here's the database, and you make the backup a private to the database save state object. Now this conforms to the requirement that you not violate encapsulation. So the database can be encapsulated with all its methods and data items, and if you make a private save state object that saves the state of the database in its entirety so it can be recreated when needed, then this is how you use the Memento design pattern. Client code interacts with the database. The database keeps storing its internal state in a private save state object. And in that way, encapsulation is not violated, and you can restore the database as needed from the save state object. So that's the Memento design pattern. It's really a backup design pattern with the added provision that you not violate encapsulation of the object you are storing. So that's an interesting way of doing things, and that's the Gang of Four design pattern way of creating a backup. You have to create a private save state object, and this private save state object maintains the entire state of the database, the entire state, so it can be recreated, but it does not give the client code direct access to that save state object. So there you have it, the Memento design pattern, a pattern for backups.